The recent media coverage of the killer Valdo Calacani nearly had me committing a thought crime. I almost thought diversity wasn't our strength. I nearly thought that releasing hordes of unknown, culturally incompatible people into our midst to commit murder and fraud and rape and terror was a bad thing. Mr. Calacani, you will recall, recently ended 3 completely innocent people and is now detained in a mental hospital. These charges were reduced on the grounds of diminished responsibility. But this was an isolated incident. It's not like this is a pattern we see again and again and again. Diversity, after all, is our strength. So I thought we'd look to see just how isolated this is. This next chap is an Eritrean. He was 27 when he stopped a perfectly innocent man and ended him in Oxford Street in 2021. He too will be detained in a mental hospital, again on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Maybe I'm crazy, but I think perhaps we should carry out some form of psychiatric assessment before unleashing people who would end others on innocent and legally disarmed British people. Now, a lot of this stuff makes the news, but it's becoming so commonplace these days that a mass brawl in a hotel in Bournemouth, complete with what you might euphemistically call street fencing, with multiple arrests, never got past a local newspaper. Now, of course, we do have a responsibility to people who've helped us. In the invasion of Afghanistan, we employed the services of interpreters who now fear for their lives from the Taliban. Asadullah Najibullah is one such man. He repaid our kindness by having non-consensual relations with a 14-year-old girl. This next fella is an asylum seeker, Ishaq al-Nur, 21, who came to the UK from Sudan. Presumably, he's one of those refugees who are welcome in some way. Now, some people regard it as insanely dangerous to allow unidentified and unvetted men to roam around the country openly. Not smiling young ladies with refugees welcome sign, of course, but some people do. Well, Mr. Al-Nur demonstrated his gratitude to the British people by forcing himself on a 17-year-old girl in a cemetery. Quite astonishingly, in open court, he said to the judge, when accused of the offence, "Yes, why not?" when admitting the attack. Some people think that religious and cultural values are incompatible with British society, but I guess they're just not celebrating multiculturalism enough. Next, we have these two who were convicted of a £50,000 disability benefits fraud. Now, you might reasonably say Indigenous people do this too, and of course that's true, but this is not an argument for importing more of them. This next woman defrauded taxpayers, namely you and I, of nearly £100,000, and she avoided jail. It's not immediately clear what benefit she brings to the UK, but there must be something, because diversity is our strength. How about this charmer? He's a lawyer who helped criminals with fake asylum claims. This is absolutely despicable because it makes fewer places available for genuine asylum seekers. However, I'm sure he's the only immigration lawyer in the entire country doing this, and it's not an obvious and systemic problem because diversity is our strength. Our next young fellow is an early starter, quite the go-getter, as you might say. He was only 13 years old and was arrested for engaging in non-consensual relations with a woman. I do have to question the cultural values and commitment to law and order of a family that can produce a reptile like this. But remember, it's a one-off, isolated example. The type of one-off, isolated example that seems all around us at the moment. Next is the fairly well-known case of 2 individuals who ended the existence of a British soldier. You may recall the individual in question was targeted because he had a Help for Heroes t-shirt on. So it seems in modern-day Britain, collect for charity and then be ended by incomers or people with certain religious devotion, or perhaps both. Please do remember, however, this was an isolated incident. Celebrate diversity. Multiculturalism is a good thing. Our next gallery of rascals, our array of cheeky chappies, were people recently convicted of being part of the so-called Rolex Rippers. These lovable rogues had it away with over £4 million worth of Rolex watches from people. And I imagine they were fairly adamant in their demands to be given the watches. Such demands surely gave way to physical compulsion on occasion. In the last couple of days, we've seen a random fellow taking a sharp object into Golders Green, which has a high concentration of another belief system. Happily, our friends in law enforcement seem to have ruled this was not anything to do with terrorism. Well, that's good. That said, I can't help but wonder if there was no political motive. Is this yet another case of mental illness? Now, I know diversity is our strength and multiculturalism is great, but I can't quite see what the benefit is to the country in this particular case. Now, there were multiple police cars and a lot of policemen on the scene, and of course that's not free. Now, if you follow certain accounts on X, formerly Twitter, you will see many cases like this next one. In this specific example, the man in question is Mr. Mohammed Nasir Hussain, but this is by no means an uncommon occurrence. In this particular case, it's alleged Mr. Hussain tried to justify his actions, namely grooming a 14-year-old girl by saying Sharia law knows no age limits. It's not clear whether or not he regarded UK criminal laws taking precedence over Sharia, which, strictly speaking, is the case. Remember, multiculturalism is a good thing. Diversity, equity, inclusion. Turning now to the world of education, who can forget the case of the Batley Grammar School? In this case, it seems the teacher committed the unpardonable sin of showing a picture of the Prophet. This caused hurty feelings, and so naturally, death threats and mob-handed protests are the appropriate response. The teacher in question has now been given a new identity, such was the severity of the threat to his well-being. Previously, I hadn't thought this was a good thing, but I guess it must be because multiculturalism is unarguably good. Who amongst us could have any possible complaint about a mob of people showing up outside your house or your place of work, masked, making threats to your life? Next, we have what you might call human traffic calming measures. Incomers who are devotees of a particular religion seem to regard it as their religious duty to pray in the street. Why they can't use one of the many mosques in the UK is not immediately clear. Cynics have suggested this is a naked display of power and disrespect for the indigenous law and customs. That, however, cannot be right, because diversity is our strength. Sadiq Khan says so, along with many others on the left. And when were they last wrong? And we can't forget one of the most wretched and evil things we've seen in Britain in the last 40 years, namely the grooming gang scandal. Now, I'm going to be careful with my language here because YouTube doesn't like certain words, but grooming is a euphemism for non-consensual horizontal activity with children on the part of multiple men. Bad as this was, and bad as it is nothing compared to the virtual complicity of certain UK authorities in turning a blind eye or covering up this abomination. But rest assured, it was an isolated incident, only happening in pretty much every major metropolitan centre in the UK with a high percentage of certain incomers. These rare and isolated incidents included Rochdale, Newcastle, Huddersfield, Oxford, Bradford, Telford, Rotherham, Aylesbury, Bradford again, Sheffield. Well, you get the picture, I'm sure. But all these were isolated incidents, one-off. It's not like literally thousands of young children were subject to non-consensual encounters with multiple men while the police did nothing. No, that could not have happened because multiculturalism is a good thing and diversity is our strength. Also, if you notice any commonality between the convicted perpetrators, I'd take a racism and unconscious bias awareness course if I were you. Then, of course, we come to the elephant in the room. Terror. On the screen now you can see example after example of innocent people blown up or stabbed or run over. Some were slightly well-known politicians, some were anonymous. Some were adults, some were children. Some were heterosexual, others seemed to be murdered simply because they were gay. I really thought we'd seen the last of that abomination. Some people were going to work, some were at a pop concert, some were socialising in parks, some were at the airport, some were in hospital, some were simply going about their business. Had we not granted the perps access to our country, all of the victims would likely still be alive. And remember, these were just the attacks that were carried out to completion rather than the many that were thwarted. But please do remember the 15 or so examples shown on the screen were all isolated incidents because diversity is our strength and multiculturalism is just peachy. Now, when you actually ask people to justify this narrative and explain why diversity is a strength, you don't get much further than the opportunity to go into different restaurants. I guess there must be more than that, because that would be ludicrously one-sided. There's surely a reason we've turned hospitals, or our hospitals, into the international health service. There's a reason why more than half the social housing in some of the better boroughs of London, such as Kensington, is occupied by foreigners. Around 4/5 of Somalis, for example, are in receipt of welfare benefits, and a similar number live in social housing. This is extremely costly, but it is a strength, in some way, to deny our own children the housing we give to foreigners. So what do the incomers bring? What is this strength that diversity provides? Well, we've seen random acts of murder on the UK streets, apparently from the mentally ill, not criminally evil and culturally incompatible. Not clear why we should host such people, but stop thinking, citizen. We've seen ethnic brawls between different groups of immigrants, which have got nothing to do with us, that we nonetheless have to police. Why on earth are we paying the police to contend with Indian versus Pakistani disputes in Leicester, for example? This has nothing to do with us, and we've no interest in it. We've seen the much vaunted Afghan interpreter starting a new life in Britain and not entirely respecting age of consent laws, or indeed consent laws. We've seen welfare fraud on a large scale, along with legal representatives from certain communities engaging in immigration fraud. We've seen organised, large-scale gang robbery of high-value items from individuals, rampant drug dealing and human trafficking. We've even seen the return of slavery in Leicester. And we've seen groups of people getting upset about alleged blasphemy, a reaction we last saw in England in the Middle Ages. We've seen our roads closed by people engaging in religious rituals, although in fairness, Just Stop Oil do something very similar. And we've seen thousands of young girls forcibly impregnated by certain groups of men, and their wider community didn't seem overly upset by it. Just let that sink in. One of the worst things you can be in wider British society is a nonce. In one of the incomer communities, it's accepted as long as you prey on white girls. Worst of all, we've all seen repeated example of terrorist murder, and I don't know a single person who thinks we've seen the end of any of this. Some politicians even shamefully say that white children should shut up for the sake of diversity. Let that one sink in. Every one of you listening to this knows for sure there will be more random murders, more ethnic tensions spilling out into brawls and gang war and stabbing, disproportionate benefit claims and benefit fraud, asylum fraud on a grand scale, organised gang robbery and theft, more drug dealing, more human trafficking, ongoing slavery which no one wants to do anything about or even admit, more rampant offence taking leading to threats and murder, more demonstrations of power as minority religious groups seek to assert their dominance, more racially aggravated gang child grooming, and more acts of terror. And even outside the criminality, we don't have enough houses or roads or hospitals or power generation or water or sewage treatment or education places or money. None of the establishment parties have shown a willingness to do anything about even these infrastructure shortcomings, any more than they'll actually introduce the immigration issue itself. So I'm forced to ask myself, outside of a few different restaurants in the high street, why is diversity our strength? Why is it better than homogeneity? Haven't we seen time and again the problems caused by communities living side by side but not integrating? Whether it's the former Yugoslavia, Northern Ireland or Rwanda, the result is always the same. Mass immigration makes life worse against a range of measures, be they criminal or logistic. So let's stop parroting slogans. Let's stop holding up refugees' welcome signs. Let's stop denouncing anyone who questions this as racist. Let's stop and think. And let's stop the abomination of mass uncontrolled immigration. If you like this, please like, recommend, and subscribe.